The Airfix WW1 tank in 1/76 scale is something that's been sitting in my stash for quite a while. It's a pretty old kit, so I thought I'd give it a go in the Back to Basics series. Hello everyone, I'm Matt, this is Model Minutes, and join me on the workbench today as I build and review the World War I Mail Tank Mark 1 from Airfix. So I've had this in the stash for quite a while, and if you'd like to take a deeper dive inside the box, check out the dedicated unboxing video. In this one I'll focus on what this kit is like to build and round off with a review at the end. As usual, I'll pop a list of products I used during this project on the screen here to give you an idea of the kind of things to go and get if you fancy replicating a similar project. And without any further ado, let's get into it. As normal, I'm going to cut the parts that I need away from their kind of sprues and runners using my cutters and then sanding away any rough areas or carefully shaving away bits of flash with a sharp knife. This is a pretty old tooling, which is no surprise as it comes as part of the Vintage Classics range, so there is a little bit of flash that will need cleaning up in a few places. Because I'm going back to basics, which is a series where I like to build things how I would have done in the past, I'm going to use some Humbrol tube glue. And the first steps were to build up the assemblies for the main guns of the tank. This was a little bit fiddly and I did have to take my time to try and figure out what the instructions were actually telling me to do. It is designed into this kit that it has a bit of play value. This was quite typical of the time period that this kit dates from. So these guns in particular should technically be able to freely traverse and elevate in their mounts on the side of the tank. Whilst I think it is possible, I would imagine it's quite difficult to do. So whilst I'll try and get this kind of working, I'm not too fussed if it doesn't at the end. With them mounted into the sides of the tank, I would build up these parts. There's like a door or hatch which goes on the rear here, which can be glued into place. And with both of these now complete, it's time to turn my attention to the main hull of the tank. There are two sides here which can be glued together. The fit is actually quite good, and I would apply a bit of pressure just to hold them in place whilst the glue dried. The assemblies containing the guns can then be glued into position on the side of the hull. Now to build up the main body of the tank, this kind of comes a bit like a box structure, and I glued the various parts together, trying to make it as neat as possible. One small suggestion I might make is to not glue the other side of the hull on at this point, although I obviously did, because you will need to add the trailer wheels in a bit, and it will be easier to do this with the other side of the tank not attached. I didn't realise that at the time, so I just carried on. The engine exhaust is glued onto the roof, and then there are some other little hatches and things which can also be glued into place. These components represent the suspension for this trailer wheel which goes at the rear of the tank. The wheels come in two halves which are glued together, and then they are attached onto the kind of trailer components. The idea here being that these can freely rotate as well. Of course, you do have to take a bit of care with your cement to try and get this done correctly. With all of that done and the little components which need to be glued onto this trailer attached, I then glued the kind of support arms for the suspension, and then the suspension glued onto the trailer. And it's at this point I realised it would have been easier to glue these into place before adding the other side of the tank. They do pop into these two little holes, and again I think there is a little bit of play value here. It's supposed to almost like pivot based on the terrain the tank is going over to kind of help it from falling over. So I just did my best here to try and fix this problem and kind of glue it into position. I then added the trailer onto the suspension arms, trying to get it in a position where it looked the most realistic, as though it would be flush with the ground and not pushing the tank up and stopping it from contacting it in a natural pose. And now on to the rubber band tracks. Given the age of the kit, it's no surprise that this comes with rubber band tracks, and again I think the intention here was that these would freely rotate, well, more like slide, over the sides of the tank to give the impression that this would be rolling along the ground. As is suggested in the instructions, I melted these rubbery tracks together. My soldering iron was used for this, and I kind of just melted the parts together to create almost a continuous rubber track. These tracks were then stretched over the sides of the tank into their little grooves where they should go. I'm not going to try and make them work because I think they'll probably end up breaking, but the idea was kind of there. And now it's time to prime. I think it's probably a good idea to prime this one because I've not washed the plastic or anything and it could be a little greasy, and this is a generic household primer which you can pick up quite cheaply in home hardware shops. After a nice even coat of this, I was ready to move on to some painting. I'm going to use some Vallejo paints, and first up I would use a buff colour. I am kind of following the painting instructions that Airfix have provided, but adding my own twist and kind of just doing what I want. A little drop of water could be used to help thin the paint down, but I would apply it over the entire tank, with that primer helping it to stick onto the surface. This might be a little vibrant, but it's a reasonably close match to the suggested colour from the Humbrol range. With that done, this US Field Drab would also be thinned with a drop of water, but now I'm going to apply it in a camouflage kind of scheme. Using the painting instructions as a guide, I am kind of just making it up as I go along here. I quite enjoyed this part of the process. It was a little bit therapeutic, just taking my time to apply the paint where I thought it looked okay. I then repeated the process using this colour, which is a uniform green. It is perhaps a little vibrant. The instructions ask for a grass green, which this kind of is, but it probably should be a bit more darker than this. But you know, I'm going to use it, and sometimes modelling is just about expressing your own individuality in how you create your models. Again, this paint was applied, building up a camouflage paint scheme. The final colour for the camouflage scheme would be this black, and this would be painted around the various areas, acting almost as an outline in some places, but also as a block colour in others. One paint that is actually recommended is this rust colour. This is a new Gen 3 acrylic from Humbrol, so it'll be interesting to see how it performs. I actually applied this to the tracks, completely neat, I didn't thin it down at all, and it went on alright. I've used the Gen 2 in the past, but they were a little bit inconsistent. This rust colour applied to the tracks quite nicely. I ended up only using one layer of this paint. I found the opacity pretty good, and it does seem to be a bit of an improvement over the previous Gen 2 versions. With all the painting now done, it's time to apply the individual decal supplied in the kit. It was soaked in warm water to help release it from the backing paper. And if you ever mix up your brush water with your cup of tea like I do, why not get a brush water mug from my merch store? It helps support the channel and you'll never make that mistake again. A little bit of Humbrol decal fix will be used to help apply this decal onto the surface of the model. It was painted on at the front of the tank where it needed to go, and then the decal carefully slid into position and a little bit more of the decal fix applied over the top. This should help soften it into the surface and help prevent silvering. I do have to be careful though, because excessive amounts of decal fix can leave a glossy residue. So when that decal was cured, I decided to just paint over the top with some Vallejo matte varnish. A thin coat of this will just dull down any glossiness left over from that decal fix and also help seal the transfer into the surface of the model. And at this point I would consider this kit to be completed in its most basic format. I imagine this is kind of what Airfix were intending for someone to be able to build straight out of the box. This kit does have a skill level of 2, so Airfix thinks it's not particularly the most difficult kit in the range, but it might be worth having some previous kits under your belt to help you with some of the complexities that this kit has, especially given the age of the tooling. I did find it a little bit tricky in places, especially given that I had to disassemble it slightly to get some parts to fit, but for the most part it has been quite a pleasant project up until this point. I do think, however, that I can take this a little bit further and add a few extra steps just to make it look a little bit more realistic. So first up, I'm going to use this Humbrol Rust Wash. This is an enamel based wash which I thinned down with some white spirit. I think it's just too powerful in its neat form, so thinning it down will make it a little bit more subtle. This would be painted over the entire tank. I'm not really too fussed about it giving a rust finish, more of a dirty brown kind of effect running into all of the recessed details to help give them a bit of dirt and grime and add a bit of shade. For adding extra rust, I'm going to use this Dirty Down Rust. This is a water-based rust effect paint, which you do have to make sure you fully mix before using. It can be thinned and reactivated with water, so I would thin it a little bit to make it into more of a kind of wash again, and it would be applied onto all of the tracks and some other elements of the tank which may require it, like the engine exhaust. As this dries, it should look as though it has a genuine layer of rust on it. I would also paint it in a few other places around the tank, just to give the impression that perhaps some paint has chipped away and some of the metal has started to rust. To improve on this effect slightly, I got out this gunmetal paint. Here I'm going to do a bit of dry brushing. So the paint was applied to the paintbrush and then removed again, so the brush feels dry. This residue was then painted over the entire tank to help catch on any raised details. This just adds a little bit of highlighting, giving a slightly more worn look in some areas, and makes the tank a little bit more visually interesting. Given the nature of this design, and there are a lot of raised details, I think this is quite an effective technique. To make this model a bit dirtier, I've got some Green Stuff World mud texture. This is dark brown mud. This texture paint was carefully applied. Pretty much everywhere this tank would have accumulated mud whilst it's been rolling across the ground. I primarily focused on all of the tracks, the areas around the tracks and the lower portions of the hull. Not forgetting of course that trailer at the back, which I think probably would have picked up some mud too. This was a little bit time consuming. I did have to take care to get this in the right places so that it looked fairly convincing. And one final step I want to do is to add some splashes. This Ammo MIG damp earth is a bit like a wash, but you can splatter it onto your projects. As you can see here, I'm using a fairly hard brush and a cocktail stick to do this, and it just gives the impression that it's accumulated more dirt and grime whilst it's been travelling through the countryside. This just adds another layer of dirtiness to the tank, helping to break up any uniformity, which can make your models look a little bit more three-dimensional. And with that, I'm going to call this project complete. And there we have it, that's another build under the belt. So this project actually took me a little bit of time because I was kind of busy with other things, and it was like a week and a half to get this one from out of the box to completed on my shelf. I think you probably could have done this in a weekend if you really wanted to, but sometimes life just gets in the way. On the other hand though, it was quite nice being able to pick this one up and put it back down, working on a little bit as I found I had the time for it. I found the hand painting of that camouflage to be quite therapeutic, and I quite enjoyed it. Of course, I don't think it's particularly accurate, given my choice of different shades, and also in the way that I've applied it. I've pretty much done my own thing here. But I did use the Airfix painting instructions as a kind of guide or for a little bit of inspiration. This is quite a dated kit and comes in the slightly unusual scale of 1/76. That harks back to when Airfix used to make 00 gauge model trains, so this would have fitted in with that. Of course, they no longer make the model trains, but still have some of these tanks in their range. Speaking of this tank in their range, if you wanted to get one of these for yourself, it's part of the Vintage Classics range, and at the time of making this video is still currently available. The recommended retail price being £6.99, which actually isn't too bad. You get 49 parts included, 1 decal, colour painting instructions, and the printed instructions inside the box are moderately okay to follow. This is kind of like a pocket money kit really. Of course, it's nowhere near up to modern day standards, with the slightly clunky design, those rather untidy rubber band tracks, and the fact that everything is kind of just a bit chunky. Of course, it did have play features designed into it, such as the trailer at the back having rotating wheels, the tracks supposedly being able to rotate around the hull of the tank, but I don't think that's particularly likely to happen in my example, and also the gun turrets being able to move, which I kind of got the barrels to elevate and depress, but I haven't got them actually able to traverse. I think it is possible, and I'm sure a more talented modeler than myself probably has been able to manage it. I have mentioned a few times that this is an old kit, and the tooling date for it dates all the way back to 1967, and it has kind of been part of the Airfix range on and off ever since then. It's also been available as part of diorama sets where it comes with other things as well, and there are also parts that replicate this as a female tank rather than the male tank I have here. It's my understanding that the male tank had 6-pounder guns, whereas the female one was armed with machine guns. This version is from 2018, but as I mentioned, it still seems to be available at the time of making this video on the Airfix website. I didn't think this was a particularly bad project. I really enjoyed going back to basics and hand painting this one and just taking my time to enjoy model making in its purest form. Moving on to those extra steps to add further dirt and grime, I think really helps give this one extra depth and weight. I'm generally quite happy with my little project here. It might not be the most accurate World War I tank out there, but for such a low price, if I ever fancy doing this one again and making it more accurate, it won't be too difficult to pick this one up. And with that, I'm going to leave this one here. Let me know in the comments what you thought of my build and whether my assessment of this kit was fair. Don't forget that we do have a Model Minutes Model Club, and if you'd like to join the Model Club like these guys on screen and help support the channel but get exclusive perks like early access to videos, check out the links in the description. Massive thanks to these guys for helping me to create consistent content. I'd like to welcome our latest members to the Model Club. They are Pretzel002, James Hannon, Ruda Takina, and Barney Millisor. Thanks for joining us. Of course, there are other ways to help support the channel if you'd prefer, but the best way to support this channel for free is by subscribing with notifications turned on so you never miss a modelling upload. Finally though, last thing to say is a massive thank you to you for watching this one, and I'll see you on the workbench again next time.